This conference will now be recorded.
Hello, everyone. I'm George Hanlon, Director of Grants at Indiana Humanities. Thank you very much for joining us on our grants webinar. We are eager to talk to you about Indiana Humanities grants that we're offering in 2020, giving you an overview and hopefully connecting you with funding opportunities to support important programs, I should say, in your community. Thank you again for joining us. Before we begin, let's talk a little bit about the agenda for the next hour or so, the things that we're going to cover. First of all, we are going to talk to you about Indiana Humanities, who we are and what we do, so you get an understanding of what our organization's mission is and the sort of programs that are meaningful for us, which will, I hope, help give you some ideas about the sort of things that we fund and make sure that they're in alignment. Of course, you're here to learn about our grant opportunities. So we are going to discuss our 2020 grants, go into depth into 6 different grants that we offer, and we're going to give you tips for applying. And then finally, towards the end, I hope to spend a few minutes talking about some other grant makers that you can connect with. We are just one of a number of organizations in Indiana and across the nation that provide funding for cultural programming. So my goal is to introduce you to some other funding opportunities at the end of our webinar. With that in mind, let's go ahead and kick in. And we'll start by telling you a little bit about Indiana Humanities so you get a feel for our organization. Indiana Humanities is a statewide nonprofit organization. Our goal is to promote the public humanities. We want to use the humanities as a tool to connect people, a way to open people's minds, to enrich their lives. Our goal is ultimately to create and facilitate programs that encourage Hoosiers to think, to read, and to talk. That is our mission, encouraging Hoosiers to think, to read, and to talk, and that's very important to us. We like to think that we provide a space, both physically and digitally, for people to connect and converse. And I will tell you that I am recording this webinar on March 25th, 2020, right in the middle of the coronavirus pandemic. So I will tell you right now, we are providing spaces primarily digitally at this point for people to connect and to converse, but certainly as the spring and summer progresses, we hope that we can start bringing people back together. But we do see ourselves as a convener, as an organization that connects people and uses the humanities to form those bonds and to use the humanities as a way to talk and to think through ideas and make communities stronger. We've been doing this for a while. We were founded back in 1972, so we are quickly approaching 50 years. We are a partner to the National Endowment for the Humanities. Now, that is a federal agency. It's been around since 1965. It and its sister organization, the National Endowment for the Arts, each of those federal organizations work with partners in the states. The National Endowment for the Humanities created a system of nonprofits around the country, and we are one of 56 state and territorial councils that receive funding through the NEH to carry out its work in Indiana. So we do get federal funds, and those are the funds that we re-grant, this pool of federal dollars that we get. So that creates some strings that we will talk through as we discuss the individual grants and some of the requirements related to them. I've been talking about the humanities a lot, and I think it's probably a good idea at this point to spend some time just to share with you what exactly do we mean by the humanities. When we say that Indiana Humanities engages people in the public humanities, what specifically does that mean? Well, we hear the expression arts and humanities a lot, and most of us know or have a good idea of what the arts are, the visual arts, the performing arts, things like that. But we often don't know what the humanities are. So this screen kind of runs through what subjects we consider to be humanities. And these are guidelines that are presented to us by our parent organization, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the group that provides us with the funding. And you'll see here that we have, it looks like about 10 different subject areas that we consider to be humanities. The first 2 listed are really the ones that are I'm sorry, the first and the third, I should say, are really the ones that we deal with a lot, literature and history. We work with a lot of libraries, a lot of historical societies. Those tend to be the humanities subjects that get the most attention. But humanities also include bullet number 2, languages. Humanities involve philosophy and archaeology, comparative religion. You see here that we deal with jurisprudence and ethics. The final 2 points that I want to make, I want to spend some time clarifying them just so you fully understand them. We do not consider as I mentioned, the arts to be a subject matter in the humanities. We leave arts programming and arts funding to our sister organization, the Indiana Arts Commission, which is the statewide partner for the National Endowment for the Arts. So when it comes to grants, for example, we are not going to fund your program to put on a play, or we're not going to give you money to put on some sort of art exhibition. But the National Endowment for the Humanities does consider art history, art theory, and art criticism to be a humanities subject. Now, we don't fund these very often, I should point out, but if you had a case where you wanted to do a performance of A Raisin in the Sun, which is a play by a woman named Lorraine Hansberry, we would not fund the production of that, but we could potentially fund you're bringing in a scholar to do a talk back around that play. So after the program, if you wanted to open up to the public, bring somebody in to talk about the history of the play and the civil rights movement, and to talk about the biography of the author, and to explore themes around that, putting the art into context, that could potentially be something that we fund. We do consider art history, art theory, art criticism to be humanities subjects. The other bullet that I'll point out here on the right-hand side, the social sciences. We don't consider social sciences per se to be humanities topics, or public policy topics to be humanities topics, but you can engage the public in conversations, in thinking about social sciences using what we call humanistic content or methods. So, for example, take immigration. That's an important issue that we're dealing with in our country, of course, right now. Immigration in and of itself is not a humanities topic. If you look here, it's not literature or language, it's not philosophy in itself, it's more public policy, it's social science. But you can use what we call humanistic methods to better understand something like immigration. So maybe if you're a library and you're dealing with issues in your community around immigration, maybe you have an influx of immigrants and you're trying to get a handle on it, maybe you have a community-wide read of a book, of a novel that deals with immigration, and you read and you discuss some of the themes of the book. Maybe you work with your local historical society to do an exhibition on the history of immigrants in your community, so people better understand the past with immigrants and can kind of reflect where you are currently based on where you've been in the past as a community. So again, immigration in and of itself is not a humanities topic, but you're using humanities subject areas like literature and history to better understand that. I will say this, that as you are thinking about programs that you apply for grants for at Indiana Humanities, and you're not quite sure if the subject matter fits into the sort of things that we fund, let me know. Give me a call. My contact information is at the end of this webinar, and we can talk through your ideas, and I'd be glad to provide you some guidance with that. So anyway, again, to recap, humanities topics here on this screen, these are the sort of things that Indiana Humanities does programming around. These are the subject areas that we fund around. If you don't see your idea represented here, give me a call and we can talk through whether that's a legitimate humanities topic that we could potentially fund with a grant. So Indiana Humanities promotes the humanities subjects through public programming. and through grants. And I do want to spend a short time here to talk to you about the public programming that we offer, just so you have a quick overview of that. There are sometimes opportunities to get some funding through our programs department. So I think it's important for you to know. So we've got a staff of 3.5 people, I think, right now that are working on programs, and they develop their own ideas for programs that we're going to carry out around the state, and they execute them. And I'm just going to cover a few of them right now. The oldest program I believe that we still have running here at Indiana Humanities is something called Novel Conversations. That is a lending library. We have a collection in our headquarters in Indianapolis, a collection of about 800 different titles. Each title has 10 to 15 copies each. And if you have a book club across the state, you can go online, see the titles that we have available, and we can lend those out to you. That's been a very popular way for 40 plus years for us to serve the community by lending books out to book clubs. It's something that if you have a book club in your community, or you're thinking about starting one, tap into Novel Conversations, because that's a great resource. Another program that we've instituted in the last few years and that's been really popular is something called the Next Indiana Campfires program. This is a program where we go around the state, we visit natural sites, nature preserves, state parks, national parks. We will get a scholar to choose some literary readings that involve environmental themes, and we'll read about the environment during the hike, or sometimes, as you can see here in this picture, it's a canoe trip or a kayak trip. We'll read literature, we'll discuss it. At the end of the hike or the canoe trip, we will often have a campfire where people will sit around and have s'mores and hot dogs and beer and continue the conversation. So that's an example of how we're trying to get humanities out in sort of a different type of program to reach a variety of audiences. This has been very popular. We also do a program called Chew on This, where often about twice a year, we will have a dinner conversation in multiple cities around the state on the same night. Strangers come together for a meal, and we will have a particular theme during the night where people will just sit around and have conversation. Another program is In Conversation, where we get people together and we'll bring in a speaker, usually of note, to have some sort of conversation. Often it's a reading. An example of this, last year we had the US Poet Laureate come to the state, and she toured about 5 different locations, 4 I should say, 4 different locations around the state. Often we paired her up with the Indiana Poet Laureate. Sometimes we had another facilitator, but she read and she discussed her poetry, and we opened it up for questions and answers. We do our programming in themes, usually 2-year themes. A couple of years ago, our theme was looking at the intersection of sciences and the humanities, and in that 2-year theme, we did a lot of programming around Frankenstein, which the novel turned 200 years old back in 2018. So you may have seen a lot of community programming around Frankenstein. We had several hundreds of programs, thousands of programs, I think, around the state in about 60 different communities. That was a really popular program that tied in with that theme. Our theme for 2019-2020 is Inseparable, and that is looking at the intersection of rural and suburban and urban Hoosiers and the dynamics between urban and rural and suburban areas of the state. And our programming takes the form rather in a number of initiatives. One of the popular programs that we've developed out of this Inseparable theme is a series of films. We commissioned 5 different films and had filmmakers apply, and we awarded a number of them, 5 of them, to fully produce the movies, and then we took it out on a film tour, and we are now making them available online. We also, as part of the Inseparable theme, have a speakers bureau with more than 20 speakers that we make available. We do have an application coming up very quickly at the end of March. You may be watching this after the fact. Keep posted, keep in touch with us, because we may make those speakers available. Right now, with the coronavirus shutdown, most of our programming has been suspended for the next few months. And so obviously we're not sending speakers out around the state right now. We may make those speakers available again later in the year. If you're interested in our programs, I should say follow us online on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. You can also sign up for our e-newsletter, and that's a great way to stay in touch. One other inseparable programming I'll point out is our One State, One Story read. We chose a book called The Year We Left Home, and we are doing community reads around that. A number of communities are doing programs. Hopefully, again, once this pandemic passes, we will rev back up again, and we will have some community reads throughout the state later in the summer and the fall. So that's an example of some of the programming that we offer through the Inseparable theme. I will also point out a couple of other initiatives that we have. We are supporting the Indiana Women's Suffrage Centennial. Indiana Humanities and 3 other partners are involved in this, and we are celebrating the 100th anniversary of women's rights to vote, women's right to vote. And so that initiative, again, a number of speaker bureau programs. There's a traveling exhibition we have on indianasuffrage100.org, a series of teacher resources, and if you're a library or some other historical society doing some public programming, there are some resources that you can tap into as well. So I would encourage you to visit indianasuffrage100.org. And then finally, we are overseeing, managing, I should say, the Indiana Authors Awards. This is a program that's been around for 10 years, and we just have started managing it. We are getting ready later this summer to announce a new round of awards. We're awarding best books in categories like fiction, nonfiction, poetry, genre, a number of different awards that we will announce later in the summer. And as part of that, again, we've got a speakers bureau where winners of the Indiana Authors Award can go around to the state. We also have some writing workshops as well. And I should point out that all of these speaker bureaus, typically the way it works is you fill out a short application online. We typically pay the speaker's fee for you. So in essence, you can get an author or a speaker for free. Sometimes you may have to negotiate for travel and mileage, but it's a pretty affordable way for you to do some humanities programming in your community. So that is the programming department, the programs that we develop and implement ourselves. The other area where the other way that we get humanities across the state, of course, is our grants program, and that's why you're here, presumably, on this webinar. So we are going to go ahead and focus the rest of the conversation around that. I will just say before leaving, if you do have questions about our programming, reach out to me and I can get you in touch with our programs team. So let's take a look at our grants program. So the goal of the grants program is to provide funding to you so you can come up with your own programs, so you have some resources to develop and implement them in your community. Rather than us coming up with our own programming and putting it out across the state, we allow you to come up with your ideas and we provide you funding to develop it and to implement it. So that's what the grants program is about. The goal of the grants program is to ensure that communities across the state have access to quality public humanities programming. We want, with our grants program, to provide a variety of grant opportunities to meet the needs of you, our partners. We also want to offer grants that allow for creative, meaningful, and impactful work. So with that, we're going to dig into our 2020 grant offerings. And over the course of the years, we refine and we enhance and we revise the grant offerings. This changes from year to year. As of now, in March 2020, this is what we're offering. I will say this: depending on the situation with this pandemic that we're in and how that continues to affect our partner organizations, we may assess the grant offerings as the summer progresses and offer a different mix. But as of right now, we are offering 6 different grants, the ones listed here, and I will go through now one by one and list what those grants are and discuss what they fund, how much we offer, and some of the other details around them. Before we do that, however, I do want to spend a little time talking about grant requirements for almost all of these grants. And I think these are important things before you start digging into our grants and before you start reading closely the guidelines. It's important to understand, these key requirements. First of all of our grants have to go to tax-exempt organizations, which means that we cannot award grants to individuals and we cannot award grants to for-profit organizations. Now, you may be wondering, what exactly do you mean by tax-exempt organization? Well, we're pretty, we are pretty flexible with that. We support a number of organizations like libraries, museums, historical societies, colleges and universities, schools, churches. We even can provide grants to other government organizations. So as long as you are a tax-exempt organization, and you don't necessarily need to be a 501c3, but as long as you're a tax-exempt organization, you can apply for a grant from us. Our grants do have to fund programs. We don't provide operating support. They have to go to help you carry out some sort of project or a program, and those projects and programs have to focus on the humanities subjects that I listed earlier on the previous slide, or they have to involve humanistic methods as we described earlier. And once again, if you are not sure whether the program that you're thinking about would fall into a humanities subject area, give me a call or email me and we can discuss that and explore. Another requirement is that our funding has to go to projects that involve humanities scholars. Now, this is something that creates a lot of questions and some concerns. I will say that reach out to me if you are not sure about this, because I can talk you through it. But basically, because these funds come from the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the National Endowment for Humanities wants to ensure that the programming that we support are legitimate humanities program, that the information is accurate, that it's well produced and well executed. They tell us that all of the programs that we support with grants have to involve scholars. What do we mean by a scholar? Typically, that is someone who's a subject matter expert in the topic that you're presenting. That person typically should have a master's degree at least, or a PhD. Sometimes we will make an exception based on life experience, based on just other factors that you may have someone who's just so well versed in the subject, and perhaps that person doesn't have a formal degree, but based on her or his background, they're the pro in the case. We can make exceptions for that. So again, call me if you have a concern about this, because I can discuss with you who you're bringing on board as your expert. If you really don't know, we have a lot of resources at universities. We can connect you with people. We often find that scholars like doing this sort of work, so we can get you in touch. So do not let that be a barrier for you at all. I mentioned that the funds have to go for public programming, and they truly have to be for a public audience. They have to be open for everyone. Once I did get an application from someone who, they theoretically were a tax-exempt organization, but they were a membership-based organization, and the program was open only to members of that organization, and we couldn't do it because, again, these grants come from taxpayer dollars, so we have to make sure that they're accessible to everyone. So it's got to be for a public audience, a school audience. We consider to be a public audience. So if you're a teacher and you want to bring in some sort of author or do some programming for your classes, you do not have to open up the class to the public at large. We do consider school audiences to be public audiences. In a similar vein, if you're working in prison and you want to do some humanities program for prison audiences, we also consider prisoners, people who are incarcerated. That's, in our minds, a public audience. Typically speaking, the site has to be ADA accessible, or if it's not, you have to explain to us in your grant application how you're going to make accommodations. Okay, so let's go ahead and dig into these 6 specific grants and give you an understanding of our offerings as of now. Let's start first by talking about our most popular grant, our Action Grant. I say it's our most popular because this is the grant that we have the most funds for. We award the most of this type of grant. What I like about this grant is that this grant could be used for across the board, any type of public humanities program. So it's sure, I call it the workhorse. Just if you've got a humanities program and it's going to the public, no matter what the subject area is, this grant is available. You'll find out later as I talk through some of the other grants, they may have some more specific subject areas that they're focusing on or some more restrictions. This is really the broadest grant that we offer. It's up to $3,000. We offer this now on a monthly basis. It used to be that we offered this grant only twice a year, but to make it more responsive, to make it more accessible, we decided to do a monthly review. So if you, for example, get your application in April, at the end of the month, we're going to collect all the applications that came in April. We're going to review them in early May, and within a few weeks, you will have an answer whether you got your grant. So we do review this very quickly and try to get back to you. One thing about all of our grants, they require a match of some type. So in this case, our smaller grants, they require 100% match. So what that means is if you are asking us for $3,000, you have to come to the table with at least $3,000 of your own funds. And that can be cash that you actually spend on it, or you can count in-kind support. So let's say that you're spending $3,000 to bring a speaker in, and those fees are going to speaker stipends. You have to bring another $3,000 to the table. That you could count your staff time that you use to develop the program and to implement it. So let's say that your executive director and your programs manager each spend 20 hours on developing this program. You can take those individuals' hourly rate and multiply it by the 20 hours each spend and apply it towards your match. If you're printing marketing, printing up some marketing materials and using maybe some grant dollars to pay for that, but the printer is giving you a discount, you can use that discount, count that as an in-kind match, and count that as well. I think this will maybe make a little more sense when we go through the budget. I'm going to show you a sample budget and we can talk a little bit more about this, and I think that might make a little more sense. But know that with each of our grants, there is a match that you've got to bring to the table. We will in each of these discuss that the rates vary. Some of them are only 50% for some of the bigger grants, but for this action grants, it's up to 100%. You've got to match. One other thing I'll say about this grant is that there is a special grant, special funds that we make available specifically for some literacy projects. We got some funding from the Indiana Newspaper and Education Foundation. So if you have an idea around media literacy, give me a call, let me know, because that is a dedicated source. We try to at least each year give one grant, hopefully more, to media literacy projects. So be aware of that as well. I should point out that on our website, and we'll talk about this later when it comes time to talking to you about applying, on our website for each of these grants, we do have in-depth guidelines that you can read through. The grant guidelines are several pages long. If you read through them, you will get a really good feel for what the grant supports. Each one has examples of past grants that we've funded. They all include the narrative questions that you have to answer. They clearly outline what's acceptable project, where some restrictions are, and things like that. So for each of these grants, go to our website and you will find some in-depth guidelines. The next grant that I want to talk to you about is the Historic Preservation Education Grant. This is a grant that we give out in conjunction with Indiana Landmarks, which is our statewide preservation organization. If you're not familiar with them, they are fantastic. I encourage you to get to know them. The Historic Preservation Education grants are up to $2,500. And the goal of this grant is to support educational programs related to historic structures, and specifically educating the community about historic structures, helping them to appreciate them, to understand them, ultimately with the goal of making sure that your community preserves historic structures. By structures, I will point out that we often mean buildings, but it doesn't necessarily have to be a building per se. Structures could be roadways, it could be things like bridges, it could be built landscapes like landscape design. Any sort of element that's created by humans, I think, would fall into this. I will point out that this is not primarily about buildings that no longer exist. I know a lot of people are very fascinated with lost architecture. This is really about celebrating the buildings, the historic structures that still exist in your community, and getting people to appreciate them. The programming around this can take the form of many different things. In really all of our grants, you can program in a variety of different methods. Workshops, could be presentations. You can produce booklets. A lot of times with the Historic Preservation Education Grant in particular, we will see walking tours of your historic downtowns, and often that takes the form of a printed booklet, but more and more people are starting to do digital tours using apps or mobile-based websites. We really encourage you to start thinking about digital humanities and getting your programming out digitally. Certainly, we're in this day and age when we are doing more of our programs online because of the need to with the coronavirus, we're starting to think increasingly, how can we provide access to humanities program remotely? So anything that you can do to take your programs out to the public and allowing them to interact via their cell phones or computers at home, we really love. The Historic Preservation Education Grant does require a 100% match. So again, let's say that you request $2,000 for your program. You've got to come to the table with at least $2,000 of your own, either money cash that you spend on that or in-kind support. Now, the HPEG, as we call it, we give out twice a year. We just had a deadline at the end of February, so we will have one more deadline for this grant coming up September 30th, 2020. So if you've got some ideas for that, keep this grant in mind. It's a really great grant. And again, call me if you have ideas that you want to talk about, and we can explore them. Next grant that I want to cover is our In Common grant. This is a grant that we are co-sponsoring with the Central Indiana Community Foundation, and it offers up to $5,000 for projects that spark in-depth conversation and insight around the persistent social, economic, cultural, and racial issues that divide our community. We especially want to fund programs and projects that are centered around dialogue and conversation, using the humanities as a tool to have meaningful conversation around some of these systemic issues that we still see in our communities related to race and ethnicity. And I'll give you a little bit of a background around why this grant ever came into practice and how we developed it. Back in 2017, we were seeing a lot of issues related to police shootings with Black people. The Black Lives Matter movement was coming to the foreground. There was a lot of tension around our country related to race and ethnicity. And the National Endowment for the Humanities, our federal partner, offered pretty much all of the state councils $15,000 for programming that addressed some of these issues. Here in Indiana, we decided that the best way that we could perhaps implement that programming was to offer $5,000 grants. So with the $15,000, we were able to give 3 grants out, and we opened up the applications in early 2017, and we had 38 applications for those 3 grants. So we knew that this was programming that was meaningful, that people really were hungering for this type of work. We, by the way, expanded our grant pool. We chipped in some of our own funds. We went out to CICF, our co-sponsor, and they chipped in some money. So ultimately, in that first round, we were able to give out 7 grants, but the need was still there. So as we revamped our grants programming last year, we decided to reintroduce that grant, and we have a few deadlines throughout the year. We just had one in February, we are offering 2 more grants in 2020, one coming up on May 31st and one coming up in September, the end of September. So keep this sort of programming in mind. It's a really great program. People have done some fantastic stuff with it. If you want some examples, give me a call and I can share with you what some of the people have done in the past. I will point out that because this is a bigger grant and because we really want to eliminate some barriers and so that a variety of groups have the opportunity to program around this, we've reduced the match on this grant to 50%. So if you ask for the full $5,000, you would only need to bring to the table $2,500. In 2019, I revamped the grants program to offer some what I hoped were some more meaningful grants. In the past several years, probably at least 10 or 15 years, our grants have been fairly small. We are starting to introduce a bit larger grants to allow people to do maybe some more in-depth work. And one of the grants that I introduced last year was an innovation grant. And this offers up to $10,000 to support programs that introduce bold or in some cases, maybe even risky ideas. The key is to utilize unique approaches or to develop programs that help you reach some underserved audiences or do some just generally creative stuff. You have to explain to us when you apply how this is innovative. Maybe this is for a program that you just have never seen anybody ever do before. Maybe this is for programming that's unique to you. Maybe others have done it, but you've never done it before. And it's really a way for you to get your programs out to a wider audience. So it's for you maybe taking a risk of doing some new and creative stuff. Again, you have to explain to us in the application how it's innovative. Because this is somewhat different, I will explain here a few of the projects that we funded last year. One of them that was a bit interesting was the Knox County Public Library. They wanted to use the funds to develop some virtual reality programs that they could introduce programming in a different sort of media to share programming that was unique in using technology to deliver humanities program. And what we especially liked about this was there was a component to buy some equipment that virtual reality equipment that they would lend out to the community and let other community groups use. And they had some training workshops to help others in the area understand how to use the virtual reality equipment and again share it. So across the community of Vincennes, Indiana, they would introduce some virtual reality humanities related programming. We kind of liked that idea. Another program that we funded with this was a prison program up in Westville, Westville up near South Bend, and that was to do some programming for incarcerated people to help do some writing workshops and encourage them to write. It included some seminars. They were going to publish some of the written work that the incarcerated people produce. And so this was a way for the group that applied for it was Holy Cross College, and it was a way for them to expand their programming into new audiences and reach out. So in this case, you have the two examples I've given, maybe some just different programming that people hadn't seen before. There's some capacity building with that one. And then also, an example of reaching out to different audiences. The thing with the innovation grant is that you've got to have a match, of course, 50%. So if you do ask for the full $10,000, you need to bring $5,000 to the table. This is a different grant in the sense that we do require you to send in an inquiry form. Before you send in a full application, we do ask you to submit an online form that is due April 30th. The grant guidelines have a link to that. So when you go onto our web page, our grants page, and you see the section for the innovation grants, there's guidelines, and there's also a link to where you can send in your online inquiry form. And basically what we do is, as a staff, we review your ideas, and those that we feel have merit, we will invite you to do a full application. If it's something that we just don't think is going to fly, we'll say so, and hopefully that will save you some time. If you are invited to do a full application, that is going to be due on July 31st, 2020. The other sort of big grant that I introduced back in 2019 and that we're repeating again this year is our collaboration grant. That offers up to $20,000. The idea that I had with this grant was I really wanted people, organizations within a community, to work together across organizational lines to develop strong partnerships, and work together to develop some in-depth humanities program that are sort of tied to a core idea or a theme. The core concepts, the key goals behind it was to provide some in-depth humanities programming, but also use this grant as an opportunity to really foster relationships. And I will say that if you want to apply for this grant, yeah, we want to see some really cool humanities programming that you carry out. Maybe it's, over the course of a week where you all do some really intense programs, or maybe this is a year-long program where each of you is contributing some different programming elements throughout the course of a year. We want to see some really in-depth programs that engage the humanities, the community in the humanities. But another key goal is really to show that you're coming together and forming collaborative relationships. So we want to see that each of the partners involved in this collaborative programming comes to the table with their own ideas. They are bringing their own staff on board to work together with you and the other partners, and that multiple people are engaged. So when you apply, we ask some specific questions about the collaboration. How is it going to benefit you? And also, how is it going to, how do you foresee extending these partnerships into the future? So keep in mind that it is just as much about the partnership as it is about the program when you apply for this grant. I should say that the collaboration can be within a community. It can be statewide. An example of that, we awarded a couple this last year. One of them was to Indiana State University in Terre Haute. They are working with groups like the Vigo County Public Library, the Vigo County Historical Society, the Debs Home in Terre Haute, the Swope Art Museum in Terre Haute, to do again, many months-long series of programs looking at the history of Terre Haute in 1919 and 1920, where each of the organizations is going to one will do an exhibition, one will do a lecture series, they're going to do a conference, looking at the history of the city in that era and exploring what we learn about that era in our own times. And there are a lot of parallels, I will say. So that's a program that we funded that was within a community. The other program that we gave a collaboration grant to last year was through Big Car Collaborative here in Indianapolis. They are working with a number of organizations down in the tiny town of New Harmony, Indiana, in Southwest Indiana, to tell the history of New Harmony, which is very interesting. They had couple of utopian communities down there. So they're working with organizations down there to do an exhibit that's going to take place up here in Indianapolis, but also down in New Harmony. Again, they're going to have a conference. They're going to have all sorts of community dinners. They're going to have a community read around a book that was written and took place in New Harmony. So that's a case where, again, it was across the state. So the collaborations can take place in a variety of communities. So call me if you have questions about the collaborative partnerships. Call me if you have questions about what sort of programs would be well suited for this grant. I'm always glad to talk to you about it. Like the innovation grant, the collaboration grant requires a 50% match. And like the innovation grant, it also requires an inquiry form that's due April 30th, 2020. So coming up here in a little over a month. Full application is due July 31st, 2020. Finally, I will point out a special grant with a deadline that's coming up fairly soon. This was a unique opportunity that Indiana Humanities is able to put forth in partnership with the Indiana Office of Community and Rural Affairs. They're the funder. They're providing us the funds for this grant. I noticed that I did not include them on the bullet like other co-sponsors, so I apologize for that, but I do want to give a shout out to the Indiana Office of Community and Rural Affairs for providing us the funds with this grant. The idea of this grant is that it is supposed to catalyze Main Street communities to promote the history of women in their community. And I will point out that this is a special grant. It's a little bit different than our other grants, which are open to all sorts of groups. This grant is open only to official Indiana Main Street programs, which is a program that the Indiana Office of Community and Rural Affairs operates. So the applicant for this grant has to be a Main Street program, but that Main Street program does have to partner with 2 other organizations within the community. So if you're in a town and let's say you're the library and you think that there is some sort of women's history program that you want to promote, look to see if you have a Main Street organization and reach out to them if you do have a Main Street program in your community, and encourage them to apply, because they have to be the ones to apply. Offer to partner with them, find another partner, and come up with some sort of program that you want to promote. Again, the idea is that it has to promote women's history, and it can take the place in many forms. It could be a preservation project. So if you have a historic structure in your Main Street area that needs to be renovated and it has a strong tie to women's history, you can use the grant funds for that. Maybe you want to do some placemaking around the women's history in your town. Maybe you want to create a mural, or maybe there's a sculpture that you want to create to celebrate women's history. You can use grant dollars for that. You can do some sort of heritage trail if you want to develop a trail through your community that celebrates women's history, and there are markers along the way that highlight some of the women achievement in your community. You can do that. We're offering this grant in celebration of the anniversary of women's suffrage, but know that it does not have to be specifically tied to suffrage. It can be women's history in general. Also, if you're working with the Main Street program, they may wonder if the project has to take place within the Main Street district itself. They have set boundaries. It does not, but it should promote visitation to the Main Street. So this is a bit unique, a bit of a unique grant. I would encourage you to read carefully the guidelines that we've posted. They're pretty in-depth. They explain in much greater detail than I am now the sort of projects that this involves. But read through them. Give me a call if you have any questions about it. Again, I'm always glad to consult with you. This grant does require a 100% match, and the deadline is coming up on May 15th, 2020. Now, if you are, I should say this for all of the grants, you may very well be listening to this webinar after many of these deadlines have passed. What I would encourage you to always do is to go into our website, to our grants page. If you go to indianahumanities.org and look at the grants tab, go to that page. We may update guidelines, especially with some of the, with the issues related around the pandemic. Guidelines may shift some. So if you're listening to this webinar after the fact, I would encourage you just to go online and see if we've shifted any of these deadlines, because they could change. Okay, now I've gone through in depth all of the 6 grants. I hope that it has provided some clarity. If not, again, go to look at the guidelines that will explain things a lot more clearly probably than I have in this webinar. But we've gone through all of the 6 grants. Now I want to spend a little bit of time talking to you about what it means to apply for a grant and how that takes place. First of all, as I've said, go online and read the guidelines. On our grants page, we have gray boxes, one for each of these 6 grants. Read the guidelines and remember some key facts: that grants are available only to tax-exempt organizations. Projects have to be tied to the humanities. The fact that you've got to include a scholar, and don't let that be a barrier to you. Reach out to me if you have any concerns about that. And remember, of course, that it's got to be for a public program, a program that's available to the public at large, or to a school or a prison audience. So before you apply for the grant, keep those 4 things in mind, And also one thing I want to talk about right now before you apply for a grant, there are some restrictions to our grants, and I've not covered this now. So I think this is a good time to talk about some of the restrictions for these grants. And these are generally across the board restrictions for all of our grants. There may be some more specific restrictions for some of the individual grants, especially the Preserving Women's Legacy grants. There are a few more, but generally for all of the grants, keep this in mind before you apply. Number one, our grants cannot be applied towards programming that involves political action or advocacy. You cannot use grant funds to encourage people to vote a particular way, to take a particular stance on some sort of political issue. So just remember that. This is not to say that you cannot fund programs related to politics. If you're a historical society and you want to do an exhibit on the history of politics, or say Indiana politicians, you can do that, but you just cannot say a particular position is better than others, or a particular candidate is better than others, or a particular party is better than others. I think you get the idea there. The grant funds cannot go towards promoting religious practices or training. We cannot say that a particular religion is the preferred religion. You cannot advocate to join a particular religious sect. But again, you can use grant dollars to discuss religion. An example, and I was really proud of this organization, library system down in Ripley County, Batesville, and some of the surrounding communities, got a grant to do a program in looking at comparative religion, and they got a couple of scholars from IU Bloomington to come in and travel to 4 different libraries to give talks about the differences between religious tenets. They looked at Christianity and Islam and Buddhism and Hinduism, and just presented neutrally what some of the different tenets are so people could understand. That sort of thing is fine, because they were not advocating. And certainly, we don't get a lot of programming out in the community around comparative religion. That application stood out, and we really were glad to fund it. So keep that in mind. I mentioned before that we do not support programming around the creation or the performance of art. Art history, art theory, art criticism is a difference. I've covered that a bit, but I will say again, if your program has art at all related, I really recommend that you give me a call and we can talk through it. We don't fund social services. A lot of people see the name Indiana Humanities and they think that we're a humanitarian organization. We do not fund food pantries or relief in that regard, rent payments, and there's a big need for that right now, especially. That is not what we do, so I just want to make sure that you're aware of that. Grant dollars cannot go towards scholarship or prizes. That is a requirement that comes to us from the National Endowment for the Humanities. We cannot use your grant dollars for scholarships or prizes. If you have a program, let's say you are dealing with young people and you want to offer some prizes, you can use your own money to have prizes as part of the program, and you cannot use grant dollars to support that. We do not allow grant dollars to go toward property purchases or equipment purchases. We do sometimes make an exception if the equipment has if there's a need for the equipment to carry out the public programming, then we will make an exception for that. So an example, if you're a library and you just need a new computer, we are not going to fund the purchase of that computer with any of our grants. But let's say you're wanting to do some oral history projects and you need to purchase or rent some recording equipment to collect the oral histories and make them available online. We have funded projects like this where they have used funds for oral history recording equipment. So if the equipment is necessary to carry out the program, we will make some exceptions for that. Again, I would encourage you, if you need to spend grant dollars on equipment, to just reach out to me and let me know. We don't fund construction or renovation. These are not for bricks and mortars. We don't operate general operating, and we don't provide funds for operating expenses at this time. You cannot use grant dollars for alcoholic beverages. And we don't allow you to use grant dollars for entertainment unless For some reason, the entertainment has something to do with your educational programming. So an example of this is if you are wanting to do a program on, let's say, the history of jazz in Indiana, and you want to spend grant dollars to hire a quartet to play different examples of jazz because that is part of the programming and that's what the program is about, you can use the money to hire those performers. Now, if it is simply you're having a program and you want a jazz quartet in the lobby of your library, or vestibule as people come in to attend the program, yeah, that's a different situation. It's got to be tied to the programming. One thing that I will point out, that a change that we've made in the last couple of years is we used to say that you couldn't use any grant dollars on funds. We do allow you now to use up to 10% of your grant request for refreshments. Often food is a great way to bring people together to discuss and engage in the humanities. So we do allow 10% of your grant application, your grant funding to go towards refreshment. So if you're asking for $3,000 in your action grant, in your grant request, you can document $300 of it, 10% to go towards food. So I've covered, again, some of the general requirements and some of the restrictions. If you feel like, given all of that your program is eligible for a grant, go ahead, go online, look at our grant proposals. In the grant proposals, or I'm sorry, I'm saying proposals, grant guidelines. Look at the grant guidelines. In the guidelines, again, most of them are like 10 to 12 pages. I'm going to list some examples of projects we've funded in the past. Those will be good ideas for you. Take a look at those. Make sure that you do understand all the administrative requirements. A lot of the stuff that I've covered, all the stuff I've covered actually is in the guidelines. It's all spelled out. One thing that I do in the guidelines is I list all of the narrative questions. When you go online, and all of our grants are online, when you go online, you're going to have to answer a series of questions. Before you do that, if you read through the guidelines, you're going to see all of those narrative questions that you have to answer. So focus on those, read through those before you even log onto the system. You might want to make sure that you know what your answers are and your responses. One of the things I might encourage you to do is actually just go ahead and type your responses into a Word document and save it, and edit it there. And then when you're ready, you can log on, and in the narrative question section, all you have to do is go and paste your answers into the sections. That might be an easy way. You can go in and save your work as you work through it, but sometimes it's easier just to do it in Word and save it there, and you've got it and you can plug it in. And, some of the times the internet does crash. I've had some people that have lost some work, and that's never a fun situation to deal with. So know that the narrative questions are listed and you have the opportunity to think through them and answer them before you even log on. When you apply for the grant, with each of the grants, you are going to have to upload some attachments, and the guidelines indicate everything that you need to include in your application packet. You're going to have to fill out a budget, and here in the next screen or two, I'm going to look at that a little more in depth. You're going to have to upload resumes. You're going to have to identify the project director for your proposed program, and you're going to have to include that person's resume. You're also going to have to list who your humanities scholars are, and you're going to have to include resumes for them. We also do ask you to include letters of support from the community, one or two letters saying, hey, I am a member of the community. I understand that XYZ organization is applying for a grant from Indiana Humanities. This is why this program is important for our community. So we do ask you for a couple of letters of support. You'll need to upload those as well. So gather all that together. When you're ready, you go online and you upload it. I want to spend a little time here talking about your budget because that is a big part of your proposal. And I think by looking through the sample budget, you can get an understanding of what we're looking for in terms of cash cost share and in-kind cost share. At the end of each guideline for each of these 6 grants, there is a sample budget. Take a look at that. That really spells out the form that we ask you to take. We do have also for each grant a budget template that you can download. It's a locked Word form that you can recreate your budget just like you see in the sample. You don't have to necessarily use that template. You can create your budget in a Word document or some other program. We do ask you, however, to use the same sort of columns and rows that we have in the sample budget, because we do use that as we have an online database where we include every, the different budget components, and we want to make sure that they all line up. And that's information we report back to the National Endowment for the Humanities. So if you don't use the budget template, recreate it in another format, but follow the same sort of style as the template that we provide. Maybe it's best to look at a sample budget. Again, you will have one of these at the end of each of your guidelines. You can see here how we've sort of laid out the budget request. I will point out that there are a few key columns. The column on the left, I will say, is set. That shows the category, and we've broken out your requests into different categories like administration, personnel, travel, supplies, etc. That column on the left will be set. You will see blank columns from grant funds on over. That grant fund column is where we ask you to divide up your grant request and how you're going to spend it. So you'll see with this grant, they're asking for some funds for some speakers, and they are going to use grant funds to pay for 3 speakers, Susan, Jim, and Sarah, and they've spelled out here that they're going to provide an honorarium to each, and they put those honorariums in the program personnel row, because these are funds that they're going to spend on personnel to carry out the program. You can see also in the grant funds column that they're going to pay mileage and travel and some other hotel and car rental expenses for their speakers, and they've documented that there in this column, and we as reviewers can see exactly where they're coming up with these funds that they're requesting. So between the program personnel and the travel, they're going to ask for a total of $1,871. Now, they could theoretically ask for some funds to pay for supplies, if they had name tags, if there were some handouts that they needed to produce. They could use grant dollars to ask for supplies, for printing and postage. If they were going to have this in a space and they needed to pay space rental, they could use grant dollars to pay for space rental. Now, in this case, they did not. They used grant dollars only to pay for program personnel and travel per diem, but you could, ask for grant funds to pay for some of these other subject areas. You can see then in the column over to the right of grant funds, this is how they're going to propose to make their match. They're counting their staff time towards their match. And presumably this organization is paying Jane Smith, the program director, and John Jones, the executive director. They're paying them for the time that they're spending on developing and implementing this program. So this organization is counting the equivalent of these people's time toward their cash cost share. So $650 is going towards their match. This organization is also spending its own money on supplies and printing, and then also AV rental. So you can see at the bottom of that column that they're bringing to the table $1,291 of their own money towards this project. And then finally, in the cost share in kind, this is where they're documenting the value of donations to the project. So they're going to, for this speakers program, use 2 volunteers. They're going to say that these volunteers are going to commit 20 hours total at $12 an hour to come up with $240 the value that's donated in kind services. One question that people often has is, what's the value? How should we value people's hourly rates? What value should we assign to that? Well, I say to this: if you're counting your staff time towards cash cost share, use the hourly rate that you pay your people. But if you're looking at volunteers, what I typically say is, what would you pay that person to do the job? We don't quibble over this too much. But we do look at it. If you're going to have volunteers who take tickets and you're paying them the equivalent, or you're counting the equivalent of $50 an hour for their time, that does not seem reasonable to us. So just be reasonable there. And we don't really have a set rate. You can see also an in-kind. A printer gave them some discount on printing of brochures, so they count the value of that discount. The library donated some meeting space, they count the value of that. So their cash cost share, or I'm sorry, their in-kind cost share that they bring to the table is $615. Combined with the cash that they bring to the table, that exceeds the grant request. So they've met their 100% match in this case. Over on the far right-hand side, we do have notes. If you need to clarify some information, you can use the notes column. I will say this, be as detailed as possible with your budget when you submit it. If you're asking for grant dollars for supplies and you say I'm spending $1,000 on supplies, but you don't give any indication of how that $1,000 is being spent, what it's going to, we probably are not going to approve that grant, or at the very least, we may not fully fund it. And as these grants become more competitive, we are turning more to partial funding. So we do look over the grant budget very closely. If there are expenses that don't make sense to us, if there are expenses that just aren't clear, we may cut them and we may say, hey, you know, you requested $3,000. We're going to offer you $2,500 because, you know, this expense didn't make sense. So be aware of that. The more detail you can provide around the budget, the better. So your grant application is all online. What you do is you go to indianahumanities.org, go to our grants page. Again, we have a gray box for each of the 6 grants. Make sure that you are looking at the right box for the right grant that you want to apply for. So if you're looking for a $3,000 action grant, make sure you look at the action grant box. If you are wanting the Preserving Women's Legacy grant, make sure that you are looking at the Preserving Women's Legacy grant box. In that box, you're going to see a brief description of the grant. You're going to see a link to the grant guidelines. You're going to see a link to the budget template that you need to fill out for that grant. You're going to see a link on how you apply online, and then you will see an Apply Now link. So when you're ready, after you've looked at the guidelines and you've downloaded the budget template, click Apply Now, and that's going to take you to our grants portal. The step-by-step instructions that you download will tell you how to work your way through that portal. If you have never applied for a grant before, you're going to have to create a username and a password. Just be aware of that. If you've applied for a grant from us before, you will have a username and password. If you have forgotten that, let me know and I can reset it for you. But anyway, you've got to log into our grants portal. And then basically you just go step through step through the grant application process. It will take you through a little section about a grant overview. It will have a narrative question section. There will be a budget section where you upload your budget. There will be a section where you upload your attachments. Be sure that you save your work often. And again, if you do your narrative questions in Microsoft Word or some other word processing program, that often helps that you can just go in and paste it in. So just as we wrap up here, the application process, truly successful applicants clearly demonstrate a tie to the humanities and define the humanities scholars. To be successful with this, you've really got to request funds for humanities activities. And again, if you're not sure, give me a call. Details really matter. Successful applicants really are specific about the types of programs that they're going to offer, who's going to benefit, when those programs are going to take place. We ask for a timeline. Successful applicants are very, specific about when the programs are, how it's all going to play out in terms of timing, and they provide details around the budget. These are competitive grants. Many of them are really competitive, and we can't fund nearly all of the applications that we receive. So it's important to you to really sell the program, articulate your need, really punch up how this is going to be beneficial to your community. You've got to be a salesperson in this case in order to be successful. So be enthusiastic about the project. Sell your program, demonstrate competency. If you have a really poorly executed application with a lot of typos and a lot of errors, that does not show to the reviewers that you've necessarily are going to have the care to carry out a solid program. So the way you present your application is reflective in our minds of how you're going to carry out the program in the end. So just be very careful with your approach, and if you have a chance, have somebody read through it as well. So those are some tips on when you apply. Before we move on to discussing some other grants that are available, I just do again want to highlight the 2020 deadlines. Remember that our small action grant that is for a variety of humanities programs, that's a rolling application. You can apply every month for that. The HPEG, the Historic Preservation Education Grant, is coming up. Next deadline, September 30th. Both the innovation and the collaboration grants, we've got an inquiry form due April 30th with full applications. If you're invited to submit one, full applications due July 31. In common grants, we've got two deadlines coming up, May 31 and September 30. And again, the Preserving Women's Legacy grants are due May 15th. Once more, I will remind you, check our website, sign up for our e-newsletter if you want to. If you go to indianahumanities.org, at the bottom of the main page, there will be a box that you can sign up for our e-newsletter. Should we shift the grant deadlines at all for any reason this year, we will announce that in our e-newsletter. We will make revisions to our website. So it always is good to check in, especially if you're listening later on in the year. Now, before I go, I do want to mention some additional grant opportunities. Again, Indiana Humanities is just one of a number of organizations that are providing some funding in the cultural arena. And I do want you to be aware of a number of our other fellow organizations that provide grants. First of all, if you're not familiar with the Historical Society and you work in the history field, you definitely should be. They have a fantastic local history services department that provides support in a number of ways. And one of the things that they offer is something called the Heritage Support Grant. This is up to $50,000 that they offer for collection support, for collections development. Some of it can go to bricks and mortar. It's a really, they fund some great stuff. It's a significant grant, $50,000. So if you're working in the history field and you have some needs, go to indianahistory.org and their grants page and look at the Heritage Support Grant. Our sister organization, Indiana Landmarks, that works in preservation, as I mentioned, they co-sponsor the Historic Preservation Education Grant with us, but they also have a number of grants available to help you preserve historic landmarks in your community. Some of them are grants for bricks and mortar. Some of them are grants to help you plan or do some studies around how to best save historic structures. So if you're not familiar with the grants that they offer, go to this link that I've offered here. Indiana Office of Community and Rural Affairs. This is the organization that is working with us to provide the Preserving Women's Legacy grants. They also offer a number of grants of their own, and go to OCRA, in.gov/OCRA to look at some of their offerings. As I mentioned, they run the Main Street program, so they have a number of grants for historic downtowns. They have historic preservation grants. They have a number of placemaking grants to improve community through art and other programs. They have just a wide variety, and I would encourage you, especially if you're in a small community in Indiana, to become familiar with them, because in addition to grants, they just have a number of other services that can truly help your community. The Indiana Arts Commission is sort of our sister organization on the arts side here in Indiana. They're a government agency, whereas the National Endowment for the Humanities works with a series of nonprofit humanities councils across the state. The National Endowment for the Arts set up a system of state agencies. So the Indiana Arts Commission is our sister organization, but they are a state agency, and they also get state funding for arts in Indiana. They offer a number of grants for project support in the arts and also operating support in the arts, and that's somewhat unique. So if you're in more of an arts related organization and you need some operating support or some project support, I strongly encourage you to go to visit the Indiana Arts Commission online and find out what some of their offerings are. I will say that across the state, they work with regional arts partners. They have a map on their website. So let's say you're in Kokomo, you can look and see who your arts partner is in your region, and you may want to reach out to that group as well. If you're not familiar with your community foundations, you very much should be. Indiana is very lucky to have a community foundation in all 92 counties, and these people are out on the front lines in your community, making sure that your community organizations have funding. So if you're not familiar with your community foundation, go to the web link that I have here and find out who your community foundation is. Make those people your best friends, because they can familiarize you with other funding in your local area. There may be family foundations. They have funds themselves that they give out. So there may be some projects that you're doing that they can support through their funding, or they again can connect you with other foundations or other funders in your area. So you need to become very familiar with them. There are a number of resources in a similar vein for grant seekers that the Indiana Philanthropy Alliance offers, and I've provided a link at their website. I've talked a lot about our federal partner, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and then on the arts side, the National Endowment for the Arts. Both of those organizations, not only do they give us working in the state funding that we redistribute, but they also make direct grants themselves. So you may, if you've got a project that is you need significant funding for, you could go look at them. I will say that these are really competitive grants at the national level. They're very hard. They take a lot of work. I don't want to discourage you, but know going into it that this can be challenging, especially if you're a smaller organization. So take a look at what they have to offer. And if you have questions, especially on the humanities side, give me a call and we can kind of talk about what that looks like. Finally, a couple of other organizations I'll point out. The Institute of Museum and Library Services is a national organization that, as the name suggests, provide grants for programming for museums and libraries. And the grants that they offer change, so I would just encourage you to go look at the website and see what they have to offer. The Indiana State Library facilitates, they administer something called the Library Services and Technology Act grants. These are grants that are used for digitization of projects. So if you need some digitization in your organization, you want to make your collections available online, you should go to the State Library's website and check out what are called the LSTA grants. The State Library from time to time has some other grant making, some other grant resources. So check out the State Library website, and I've got the link there. We've been talking on this webinar for a long time, so I think it's time to wrap up. Before I go, just some key takeaways. If you are interested in a grant, take the time to fully formulate your ideas, plan your program, and really develop a specific product, a program that you want to apply for, and think about how you're going to execute it and what the impact is going to be. Specifics are important. Come to us with as much detail as possible. Allow yourself plenty of time to complete the application. As I mentioned, all of these applications actually have attachments. They've got a budget you've got to work through. You've got to get letters of support. You have to collect resumes. If you wait until the night before it's due, you're not going to have time to do it. So allow plenty of time to complete the application. One thing I did not say about this, for the action grant, which is a rolling grant, if you do not get the grant, I will call you and give you feedback. And if you have allowed yourself, a number of months before you're actually wanting to execute the program, and you apply early enough, you can come back and you can apply again after you get some feedback from me. So there's some advantage to applying with time to spare. Before submitting online, ask somebody to read it, provide you with input. If you have questions about your application, if you want me to take a quick look at your budget, or you want a clarification around some of the questions, if you've allowed yourself enough time, you can reach out to me and I can provide support. If nothing else in this entire webinar, I hope I've emphasized time and again to reach out to us with questions, whether that's email or that's a phone call. I'm always glad to consult and talk to you about it. And so finally here in the very last slide, I do want to provide my contact information. I'm George Hanlon, Director of Grants at Indiana Humanities. You see my email address here. You see my phone number. You can always go to indianahumanities.org. Again, I encourage you to visit our website on the main page, scroll down and apply, or rather sign up for our e-newsletter so you stay up to date not only with our grant offerings, but again, our programs that we're putting on and some of the stipends that we offer through our programs department. We truly are committed to getting the humanities across the state, to helping you and your communities use the humanities as a way to engage people in your community, to have conversations, to use the humanities to fulfill our mission of thinking, reading, and talking. So we truly want to support you. Call us with questions. I hope that you found this webinar very helpful, and thank you so much for your time. I do look forward to working with you and perhaps reviewing some applications that you submit.